The fluorescent lights in the 42nd floor hallway flickered as Brooklyn Pierce pushed her janitor's cart past the executive conference room, the squeak of one stubborn wheel masking the sound of her breathing, apparatus hidden beneath her oversized maintenance uniform. Through the frosted glass, she could make out the silhouettes of 6 figures seated around an oval table, their voices a low murmur that would have been indecipherable to anyone else. But Brooklyn Pierce wasn't anyone else. She was a United States Navy SEAL, and she had been mopping these floors for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The tiny recording device tucked behind her left ear picked up fragments of conversation as she deliberately slowed her pace. Shipment arrives Thursday. The Senator's committee will never. 15 million in untraceable. Brooklyn's pulse remained steady at 62 beats per minute, exactly where it had been during her last underwater demolition mission in the Persian Gulf. She adjusted her grip on the mop handle, muscle memory from countless weapons training making the movement fluid and precise. The calluses on her palms, earned through years of rope climbing, weapons handling, and hand-to-hand combat, were hidden beneath the worn work gloves that had become as much a part of her identity as the faded blue jumpsuit with Betty embroidered on the chest pocket. Betty had been her cover for over 3 years. Betty Martinez, age 38, divorced mother of 2, working the night shift at Meridian Industries to make ends meet. Betty spoke broken English with a slight accent, kept her head down, and never looked anyone in the eye. Betty was invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. Brooklyn Pierce was none of these things. The conference room door opened suddenly, and Brooklyn quickly resumed her methodical floor mopping, her posture shifting into Betty's characteristic hunch. Richard Hawthorne, Meridian CEO, emerged with his signature cold smile, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. He walked past Brooklyn without so much as a glance, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the industrial cleaner she'd been using as cover for the past hour. But as Hawthorne's footsteps faded toward the elevator bank, Brooklyn noticed something that made her Navy SEAL training kick into high alert. A thin manila folder had fallen from his briefcase, sliding partially under her cleaning cart. She glanced around the empty hallway, listening for any approaching footsteps or voices. The building's after-hours security system indicated only 12 people remained in the 40-story structure, all accounted for in her mental map of the buildings. Occupants. Brooklyn bent to retrieve the folder, her movements careful and deliberate. The header read "Project Nightfall Classified" in bold red letters. Inside were shipping manifests, financial records, and what appeared to be correspondence with several offshore shell companies she recognized from her intelligence briefings. Companies that were supposed to be defunct. Companies that had been linked to weapons, trafficking, and international money laundering operations that had resulted in the deaths of American service members overseas. Breath caught in her throat as she recognized a name on one of the documents. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, her former SEAL team leader. Morrison had been killed 18 months ago in Syria, officially by enemy fire. The document in her hand suggested otherwise. The elevator chimed, and Brooklyn quickly photographed the relevant pages with the camera hidden in her cleaning supply bottle before sliding the folder back where Hawthorne had dropped it. She resumed mopping, her mind racing through the implications of what she'd just discovered. 3 years of careful infiltration, 3 years of playing the part of Betty the janitor, and finally she had found the smoking gun that would bring down not just Meridian Industries, but potentially an entire network of defense contractors who had been selling American military secrets to the highest bidder. The elevator doors opened, and she heard Hawthorne's voice cursing about his missing folder. Brooklyn kept her head down, pushing her cart toward the service corridor as if she hadn't heard anything. But her hand moved to the emergency beacon sewn into the lining of her uniform, ready to signal her handler that the mission was entering its final phase. After 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, Brooklyn Pierce was about to stop being Betty Martinez. And when she did, Meridian Industries and everyone connected to it would discover that the woman they'd been ignoring, dismissing, and treating as invisible was actually one of the most dangerous people in the building. The question was no longer whether she could maintain her cover. The question was whether she could survive long enough to complete her mission before her cover was blown, and the most powerful defense contracting corporation in America realized they had a Navy SEAL mopping their floors. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days earlier, Lieutenant Brooklyn Pierce had stood in a sterile briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, staring at photographs of Meridian Industries' executive team while her commanding officer outlined what would become the longest undercover operation of her 12-year military career. Meridian Industries isn't just another defense contractor, Commander Sarah Chun had explained, her finger tracing connections on a digital whiteboard that looked like a spider web of corporate intrigue. They've got contracts with 17 different branches of the military, access to classified weapon systems, and influence that reaches into Congress, the Pentagon, and foreign governments. Intelligence suggests they're selling our secrets, but they're too well connected for a conventional investigation. Brooklyn had studied each face on the screen, memorizing details that would later help her navigate the corporate hierarchy she'd be infiltrating. Richard Hawthorne, CEO, Harvard MBA with a Princeton undergraduate degree and a reputation for ruthless business practices. Marcus Webb, Chief Financial Officer, former Treasury Department official with connections throughout the intelligence community. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Head of Research and Development, ME graduate whose weapons systems designs had revolutionized modern warfare. Your mission, Commander Chun had continued, is to get inside Meridian Industries and find proof of their illegal activities. We believe they're not just selling secrets, they're actively compromising missions, getting our people killed, and profiting from American blood. The photos on the screen had shifted to show young service members who had died in operations where Meridian supplied intelligence or equipment had failed catastrophically. Brooklyn recognized several faces from her own deployments, including Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, who had been killed by an IED that somehow appeared to have been designed specifically to counter the armor on her vehicle. "How deep do you want me to go?" Brooklyn had asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of what was being proposed. "As deep as necessary," Commander Chun had replied. "We've created a complete identity for you, Betty Martinez. 35 years old, divorced, 2 children living with their father in Phoenix. Work history in maintenance and custodial services, no criminal background. Perfect for a night shift janitorial position. Meridian Industries outsources their cleaning to a company called Spotless Solutions, and we've arranged for Betty to be hired. The transformation from Navy SEAL Brooklyn Pierce to janitor Betty Martinez had taken 6 months of intensive preparation. Brooklyn had spent weeks in language coaching to perfect Betty's slight accent, hours studying custodial procedures and industrial cleaning techniques, and months researching the background of her new identity until Betty's life story felt as real as her own. The most challenging aspect hadn't been learning to mop floors or empty trash cans, it had been learning to make herself invisible. Brooklyn Pierce commanded attention wherever she went. At 5'8", with an athletic build maintained through years of military training, piercing green eyes, and the confidence that came from surviving SEAL training, she naturally drew notice. Betty Martinez needed to be the opposite of everything Brooklyn Pierce was. The physical transformation had been dramatic. Brooklyn had let her regulation military haircut grow out into Betty's shoulder-length brown hair, streaked with premature gray from the stress of raising 2 children alone. She wore colored contact lenses that changed her eyes from green to brown, used makeup to create the appearance of fatigue and stress lines, and adopted a wardrobe of ill-fitting clothes that concealed her muscular frame. But the psychological transformation had been even more complete. Brooklyn had studied recordings of women who worked multiple jobs to support their families, learning to carry herself with Betty's characteristic exhaustion and quiet resignation. She practiced Betty's speech patterns until the slight accent and grammatical inconsistencies became natural. She memorized details about Betty's children, Miguel, age 14, and Sophia, age 11, until she could speak about them with genuine maternal concern. The cover had been tested thoroughly before deployment. Brooklyn spent 2 months working as Betty at various cleaning companies in San Diego, perfecting her persona while intelligence officers observed from a distance. She cleaned office buildings, retail stores, and restaurants, learning the rhythms of custodial work and the art of being overlooked by the people whose spaces she maintained. Finally, on a cold Tuesday morning in November, Betty Martinez had reported for her first shift at Meridian Industries. The hiring manager, a distracted woman named Carol Thompson, had barely looked up from her paperwork as she handed Betty her uniform and ID badge. "Night shift runs 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Carol had explained, her tone suggesting she'd given this speech hundreds of times. "You'll be working floors 35 through 45 executive levels. Security is tight up there, so you'll need your badge for elevator access. Don't touch anything you don't need to touch. Don't go into any offices unless they're specifically on your cleaning list. And don't talk to anyone unless they talk to you first. Most of the executives work late, so you'll see people around. Just stay out of their way." Brooklyn had nodded, adopting Betty's deferent posture. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. Your supervisor is Frank Kowalski. He's been here 15 years, knows every inch of this building. You do exactly what Frank tells you when he tells you to do it, and you'll be fine. Screw up and you're out. We've got a waiting list of people who want this job." That first night, Brooklyn had met Frank Kowalski, a 62-year-old Polish immigrant who had worked custodial jobs for most of his adult life. Frank was exactly what Brooklyn had expected, a man who took pride in his work despite the low pay and little recognition. He was also exactly what she needed, a mentor who could teach her the intricacies of her cover job while remaining completely oblivious to her true identity. "Building's got 45 floors. Frank had explained as he led Betty through the service corridors that would become her highway through Meridian Industries. "Bottom 15 floors are general offices, nothing too important. Floors 16 through 30 are department heads, project managers, that kind of thing. But 31 through 45, that's where the real money is. That's executive country, and that's where you'll be working." Frank had shown her the supply closets, the service elevators, and the maintenance areas that would give her access to virtually every part of the building. He'd explained the security protocols, the cleaning schedules, and the unwritten rules that governed the relationship between custodial staff and the executives who barely acknowledged their existence. "Rule number 1, Frank had said, his weathered face serious. "You're invisible up there. They don't see you, they don't think about you, and they sure as hell don't want to talk to you. That's how you want it. The minute you become visible is the minute you become a problem. And problems get fired." Brooklyn had absorbed every detail, knowing that her survival and the success of her mission depended on perfecting the art of invisibility that Frank was describing. She needed to be present enough to do her job effectively, but invisible enough that the executives would speak freely in her presence, treat her as part of the furniture, and never suspect that Betty Martinez was anything more than another immigrant, working a thankless job to support her family. The first few months had been an exercise in patience and observation. Brooklyn had mapped every office, learned the names and habits of dozens of executives, and begun identifying the key players in what she was increasingly certain was a sophisticated criminal operation. But she had to move slowly, carefully, building Betty's reputation as a reliable, unobtrusive employee while gathering intelligence that could eventually be used to build a case against Meridian Industries. She learned that Richard Hawthorne arrived at the office by 6 a.m. every day and rarely left before 10 p.m. His assistant, Margaret Crowley, was fiercely protective of his schedule and his privacy. Marcus Webb, the CFO, had a drinking problem that he thought he was hiding successfully, and Dr. Elena Vasquez often worked through the night in the research and development labs on the 38th floor. Brooklyn also learned about the security measures that protected Meridian Industries' secrets. Electronic surveillance was comprehensive, but followed predictable patterns. Guard rotations were regular and professional, but relied heavily on the building's reputation and the assumption that anyone with access belonged there. Most importantly, she learned that the night shift custodial staff had access to areas and conversations that would be impossible for any other type of undercover operative to reach. As Betty Martinez, she was present but unnoticed during late-night strategy sessions, after-hours phone calls with foreign contacts, and private meetings where deals were made that violated numerous federal laws. The executives spoke freely around her because, in their minds, she was incapable of understanding the significance of what she was hearing. They were wrong. The breakthrough had come 8 months into her assignment. Brooklyn was cleaning the conference room on the 42nd floor when she discovered that the room's secure communication system had been left active after a late-night video conference with what appeared to be representatives of the Russian Defense Ministry. By adjusting the volume controls while appearing to dust the equipment, she was able to access recordings of previous conversations that detailed the sale of American weapons technology to Russian manufacturers. That intelligence had been passed to her handlers through dead drops and coded messages, leading to the expansion of her mission and the installation of more sophisticated surveillance equipment in her cleaning supplies. What had begun as a routine investigation into potential corruption had evolved into a comprehensive operation to document and destroy an international conspiracy that was directly responsible for American military casualties overseas. But as Brooklyn's access to Meridian's secrets had grown, so had the risks associated with maintaining her cover. The longer she remained as Betty Martinez, the greater the chance that someone would notice inconsistencies in her behavior or background. Every day brought new challenges to her carefully constructed identity, and every night brought her closer to the kind of intelligence that could either make her career or get her killed. 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days after first putting on Betty Martinez's uniform, Brooklyn Pierce had finally found the evidence she needed to bring down Meridian Industries. The question now was whether she could extract that evidence and herself before her 3 years of patient deception were exposed. Rhythm of night shift custodial work had become as natural to Brooklyn as breathing underwater or assembling a rifle in complete darkness. By her 4th month as Betty Martinez, she could navigate Meridian Industries' 45 floors with her eyes closed, her internal clock calibrated to the building's after-hours patterns with military precision. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 5 nights a week, Brooklyn pushed her cart through the same corridors, cleaned the same offices, and emptied the same trash cans that had become her windows into one of the most secretive defense contracting operations in America. What had initially felt like an elaborate performance had evolved into something more complex, a deep undercover identity that required her to live as Betty Martinez not just during work hours, but 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Her apartment in Queens was Betty's apartment, furnished with Betty's belongings and decorated with Betty's family photographs. The pictures on the refrigerator showed Miguel and Sophia, Betty's children, at school events and family gatherings that Brooklyn had memorized from the cover identity files but never actually experienced. The worn furniture and second-hand appliances told the story of a single mother stretching every dollar, working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Brooklyn had even established relationships within Betty's community, becoming a regular at the laundromat 3 blocks from her apartment, shopping at the bodega where the owner's nephew had a crush on Betty and always gave her an extra orange when she bought fruit. She attended St. Catherine's Catholic Church on Sundays, sitting in the back pew and participating in the Spanish language services with the linguistic skills she'd developed for her cover. The most challenging aspect of maintaining Betty's identity had been creating believable reasons for her absence during Brooklyn's required check-ins with her Navy handlers. Betty's story explained these disappearances through a second job cleaning offices in Manhattan 2 nights a week, a detail that provided both cover for her intelligence work and additional credibility for her financial struggles. At Meridian Industries, Betty had become exactly what Frank Kowalski had promised she could be: invisible. After more than a year of consistent, unremarkable work, the executives on floors 35 through 45 barely registered her presence. She had perfected the art of being simultaneously present and absent, there but not there, noticed only when something wasn't cleaned properly. This invisibility had given Brooklyn access to conversations, documents, and meetings that would have been impossible for any traditional intelligence operative to observe. Corporate executives, government officials, and foreign agents spoke freely around Betty because they had unconsciously categorized her as part of the building's infrastructure, rather than a potential security risk. The intelligence she had gathered over 3 years painted a disturbing picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond simple contract fraud. Meridian Industries wasn't just overcharging the government or cutting corners on quality control. They were actively selling American military secrets to foreign powers, manipulating weapon systems to create battlefield failures, and using their political connections to ensure continued access to classified information. Brooklyn's reports to naval intelligence had documented sales of radar technology to Chinese manufacturers, the deliberate introduction of vulnerabilities into armor systems sold to allied nations, and the systematic compromise of communication systems used by American Special Operations Forces. Each piece of intelligence had been carefully gathered, photographed, and transmitted through a network of dead drops and coded communications that ensured Betty Martinez remained above suspicion. But the longer Brooklyn maintained her cover, the more complex her mission became. Naval intelligence had initially expected her assignment to last 6 to 9 months, long enough to gather evidence of basic contract violations that could be prosecuted through conventional channels. Instead, her discoveries had revealed a conspiracy that required ongoing surveillance and ever deeper infiltration to fully document. The personal cost of maintaining Betty's identity had been substantial. Brooklyn had been forced to decline family visits, skip friends' weddings, and miss military ceremonies that would have been significant milestones in her naval career. Her commanding officers understood the demands of deep cover work, but they couldn't shield her from the psychological impact of living someone else's life for years at a time. The most difficult challenge had been suppressing her natural instincts and responses to the situations she encountered. As a Navy SEAL, Brooklyn's training emphasized direct action, aggressive response to threats, and the physical and mental dominance that had kept her alive in combat situations around the world. As Betty Martinez, she had to respond to disrespect, condescension, and sometimes outright abuse with deference and submission. There had been moments when executives had been openly cruel to Betty, treating her with a casual contempt that would have triggered immediate and decisive response from Brooklyn peers. She had been forced to silently endure sexual harassment from Marcus Webb, who had a habit of making inappropriate comments to female staff members when he'd been drinking. She had watched Richard Hawthorne berate custodial workers for minor infractions while congratulating himself for providing jobs to people like them. She had listened to conversations where American service members were discussed as acceptable casualties in business transactions that would increase Meridian's profit margins. Each incident had been carefully cataloged in her memory and her reports, adding to the mountain of evidence that would eventually be used to prosecute the individuals responsible. But maintaining her cover had required her to witness acts of corruption and cruelty without being able to respond in ways that aligned with her values as a military officer and as a human being. The isolation had been another significant challenge. Deep cover operatives were by necessity cut off from their normal support systems. But Brooklyn's situation was particularly difficult because she was maintaining her cover identity even when not at work. Betty Martinez had no close friends, no romantic relationships, and no social connections that could provide emotional support. During the inevitable stresses of undercover work, her handlers had provided psychological support through carefully orchestrated meetings disguised as routine activities, counseling sessions that appeared to be conversations with a social worker helping Betty navigate single motherhood, debriefings that looked like meetings with a representative from her children's school district. But these contacts were necessarily limited and formal, lacking the personal relationships that sustained most people through difficult periods. The technical aspects of her surveillance work had become increasingly sophisticated as her mission evolved. What had begun with simple observation and memorization had expanded to include electronic surveillance devices hidden in her cleaning supplies, photography equipment disguised as personal items, and communication systems that allowed her to transmit intelligence in real time when circumstances required immediate action. Brooklyn had become expert at concealing recording devices in vacuum cleaners, hiding cameras in spray bottles, and using her janitor's cart as a mobile surveillance platform. She had learned to position herself during cleaning activities to optimize audio recording of conversations, to recognize and photograph important documents during routine trash collection, and to identify opportunities for accessing secured areas when maintenance activities provided legitimate reasons for her presence. The psychological complexity of her situation had intensified as she witnessed the human cost of Meridian Industries' activities. Brooklyn had access to internal communications that detailed the impact of compromised equipment on American forces overseas, financial records that showed how weapons failures translated into increased profits through replacement contracts, and strategic documents that revealed how political influence was used to prevent investigations into suspicious patterns of military casualties. She had read casualty reports that listed the names of service members killed by equipment that Meridian Industries knew was defective, correspondence with foreign agents that detailed the sale of information used to target American operations, and financial projections that calculated acceptable loss ratios for American personnel. The weight of this knowledge, combined with her inability to take immediate action to prevent future casualties, had tested her psychological resilience in ways that combat never had. As Brooklyn approached the end of her third year as Betty Martinez, she had begun to recognize symptoms of what psychologists called identity erosion, the gradual blurring of boundaries between an operative's true identity and their cover identity. She found herself thinking in Betty's accent during off-duty hours, feeling genuine concern for Betty's fictional children, and experiencing emotional responses that belonged to Betty rather than Brooklyn. This psychological phenomenon was well documented among long-term undercover operatives, but recognizing it didn't make it easier to manage. Brooklyn had to constantly remind herself of her true identity, her real relationships, and her actual mission to prevent Betty Martinez from becoming more real than Brooklyn Pierce. The breakthrough with the Project Nightfall documents represented both the culmination of her 3-year infiltration and the beginning of its most dangerous phase. The intelligence she had gathered was sufficient to trigger prosecutions, congressional investigations, and criminal charges that would destroy Meridian Industries and potentially implicate dozens of government officials and foreign agents. But extracting that intelligence and herself from her carefully constructed cover would require her to abandon an identity that had become integral to her daily existence and return to a life that now felt almost as foreign as Betty Martinez's had when she first assumed it. The transition from Betty Martinez back to Brooklyn Pierce would be the most challenging aspect of a mission that had already tested every skill she had developed in 12 years of military service. And if she made any mistakes during that transition, both Betty Martinez and Brooklyn Pierce might cease to exist permanently. Dr. Elena Vasquez worked later than anyone else at Meridian Industries, often remaining in the research and development laboratories until 2 or 3 in the morning. This made her both the most valuable intelligence target for Brooklyn's mission and the most dangerous person to observe, since the late hours meant that Brooklyn would be cleaning the R&D floors when Vasquez was most likely to be engaged in sensitive work. The 38th floor housed Meridian's most classified research projects, protected by additional security measures that included biometric scanners, electromagnetic shielding, and motion sensors that could detect unauthorized movement even during custodial hours. Brooklyn had spent months learning the rhythms of the security system, identifying windows of opportunity when she could extend her cleaning activities to gather intelligence without triggering alerts. The breakthrough had come 6 months earlier when she discovered that the laboratory's air filtration system required weekly maintenance that temporarily disabled some of the motion sensors. By timing her cleaning activities to coincide with the maintenance schedule, Brooklyn could position herself to observe Vasquez's work without being detected by the electronic surveillance systems. What she had observed during those carefully planned infiltrations had revealed the true scope of Meridian Industries' criminal activities. Dr. Vasquez wasn't just developing weapons systems for the American military, she was simultaneously developing countermeasures that would be sold to foreign powers, ensuring that any technological advantage provided to American forces would be temporary at best. Brooklyn had watched Vasquez test armor-piercing rounds designed to defeat the very armor systems that Meridian was manufacturing for American troops. She had observed the development of electronic warfare systems that could disable American communication equipment, guidance systems that could be remotely compromised to cause precision weapons to miss their targets, and detection systems that could be defeated by specific electromagnetic signatures that would be provided to America's enemies. The most damning evidence had been Vasquez's correspondence with foreign research institutions, particularly the Vasilyev Institute in Moscow, which was known to be a front for Russian military intelligence. The emails, which Brooklyn had photographed during routine trash collection, detailed the transfer of classified American weapons technology in exchange for payments that were laundered through a complex network of shell companies and cryptocurrency transactions. But the most disturbing discovery had been Vasquez's research into what she called selective failure systems, weapons, and equipment designed to function normally during testing and training but fail catastrophically under specific battlefield conditions. The research notes, which Brooklyn had found during routine cleaning of Vasquez's private office, included detailed analyses of American casualties that had resulted from equipment failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. The notes revealed that many of these failures had been intentional, triggered by remote signals or environmental conditions that Meridian Industries' clients could predict and exploit. American service members had died not because of enemy action or equipment malfunction, but because their own weapons and protective gear had been deliberately sabotaged by the company contracted to keep them safe. Brooklyn's Navy SEAL training had prepared her for many forms of betrayal, but the systematic murder of American military personnel for profit had challenged her psychological resilience in ways that combat never had. Reading Vasquez's clinical descriptions of acceptable casualty rates and optimized failure parameters while maintaining Betty Martinez's different demeanor had required every ounce of discipline she had developed. In 12 years of military service, the intelligence had been passed to her handlers through increasingly sophisticated communication methods as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. What had begun as routine dead drops had evolved into encrypted digital communications, emergency signal protocols, and contingency plans for rapid extraction if her cover was compromised. Naval intelligence had responded to Brooklyn's reports by expanding the investigation to include other defense contractors, congressional oversight committees, and international law enforcement agencies. The evidence she was gathering had implications that extended far beyond a single corrupt corporation to include an international network of arms dealers, corrupt politicians, and foreign intelligence services that were actively working to undermine American military capabilities. But, as the investigation expanded, so did the risks associated with Brooklyn's continued infiltration. The longer she remained undercover, the greater the chance that someone would notice patterns in her behavior or background that didn't align with Betty Martinez's cover story. More concerning was the possibility that the targets of her investigation would become aware of the intelligence operation and begin taking countermeasures. Brooklyn had begun to notice changes in the security protocols at Meridian Industries that SUGGESTED increased awareness of potential threats. Badge access logs were being audited more frequently, surveillance systems were being upgraded, and there were rumors among the custodial staff that background checks were being repeated for employees who had been with the company for more than 2 years. These developments had prompted discussions with her handlers about transitioning her mission into its final phase, but the intelligence she was gathering was too valuable to abandon prematurely. The Project Nightfall documents represented the kind of smoking gun evidence that could trigger congressional hearings, criminal prosecutions, and international diplomatic incidents that would permanently disrupt the network she had spent 3 years infiltrating. The personal cost of her extended mission had become increasingly apparent in her interactions with other custodial workers, particularly Frank Kowalski, who had become something like a father figure to Betty Martinez. Frank's genuine concern for Betty's welfare, his pride in her work performance, and his protective attitude toward all of the night shift custodial staff had created emotional complications that Brooklyn hadn't anticipated when she first assumed her cover identity. Frank had been particularly concerned about Betty's health and stress levels, attributing her occasional distraction and fatigue to the challenges of working multiple jobs while worrying about her children in Arizona. His offers to help with extra work, his gifts of homemade Polish food, and his gentle advice about dealing with difficult executives had created a relationship that felt more real than many of the professional relationships Brooklyn had maintained. In her military career, the other custodial workers had also accepted Betty as part of their extended family, sharing stories about their own families, offering support during what they believed were Betty's financial difficulties, and including her in the informal social networks that sustained them through the isolation of night shift work. These relationships had provided emotional support that Brooklyn hadn't expected but had become increasingly dependent upon as her mission extended far beyond its original timeline. The most challenging aspect of maintaining these relationships had been concealing her true reactions to the information she was gathering about Meridian Industries' activities. When Frank complained about executives treating custodial workers with disrespect, Brooklyn had to suppress her impulse to reveal that she had evidence of far worse behavior. When other workers discussed family members serving in the military, she had to hide her knowledge that Meridian Industries was directly responsible for putting those service members at risk. Brooklyn's relationship with Margaret Crowley, Richard Hawthorne's assistant, had developed into something more complex than her purely observational relationships with other Meridian employees. Crowley worked later than most executives, often remaining in the office until midnight or later to manage Hawthorne's extensive international communications and travel schedule. This schedule overlap had created numerous opportunities for conversation between Betty and Margaret. Despite the significant differences in their apparent social and economic status, Margaret had initially treated Betty with the same casual dismissal that most executives showed toward custodial staff, but over time their interactions had evolved into something approaching friendship. Margaret had confided in Betty about her frustrations with Hawthorne's demanding expectations, her concerns about some of the company's business practices, and her personal struggles with relationships and career advancement. These conversations had provided Brooklyn with invaluable intelligence about Hawthorne's activities and decision-making processes, but they had also created ethical complications that her training hadn't fully prepared her to handle. Margaret's trust in Betty was genuine, based on her perception of Betty as someone who posed no threat to her position or security. Using that trust to gather intelligence felt like a betrayal that went beyond the normal deceptions required for undercover work. The situation had become even more complex when Margaret had begun to share information that suggested she was aware of some of Meridian Industries' questionable activities but felt trapped by her financial dependence on her position and her fear of retaliation if she reported what she knew. Margaret's internal conflict between her ethical concerns and her personal security mirrored Brooklyn's own struggle to balance her mission objectives with her growing emotional investment in the relationship she had developed during her extended infiltration. As Brooklyn prepared to transition her mission into its final phase, she faced the prospect of betraying people who had shown genuine kindness and concern for Betty Martinez, people who had no knowledge of or involvement in the criminal activities she had been investigating. Frank Kowalski, Margaret Crowley, and the other custodial workers who had accepted Betty as part of their community would be left behind when Brooklyn resumed her real identity, and they would never understand why someone they had trusted and cared about had simply disappeared from their lives. The psychological preparation for this transition had become as important as the operational planning for extracting the intelligence she had gathered. Brooklyn would need to abandon an identity that had become integral to her daily existence and return to relationships and responsibilities that now felt almost foreign after 3 years of living as someone else. The first sign that Brooklyn's carefully constructed cover might be in jeopardy came on a Tuesday night in March, during what should have been routine cleaning of the 39th floor executive offices. She was emptying the trash in Marcus Webb's office when she noticed that his computer screen was still active, displaying what appeared to be financial records for accounts she recognized from her surveillance of Meridian's money laundering operations. Webb had left for the evening 2 hours earlier, following his usual pattern of staying late enough to appear dedicated while avoiding the late-night meetings where the most sensitive business was conducted. His departure routine was consistent: coat from the closet, briefcase from the desk drawer, lights off but computer still running to suggest he might return. Brooklyn had observed this pattern dozens of times and had used his predictable absence to gather intelligence from documents he left accessible, but tonight was different. As Brooklyn approached Webb's desk to empty the small trash can beside it, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. The office door, which she had left open according to standard custodial protocol, was slowly closing. She turned to see Webb standing in the doorway, his coat still on but his briefcase set aside, watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately interpret. "Betty, right?" Webb said, his voice carrying the slight slur that indicated he'd been drinking during his dinner meeting. "You're the one who cleans my office." Brooklyn felt her pulse increase slightly but maintained Betty's characteristic nervous deference. "Yes, sir, Mr. Webb. I'm sorry if I disturb you. I can come back later to finish." No, you're fine." Webb stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, a violation of building policy that required doors to remain open when custodial staff were working in executive offices. "I just forgot something and came back." "Don't mind me." Webb moved toward his desk, positioning himself between Brooklyn and the door in a way that could have been coincidental but felt intentional. His proximity to the computer screen made it impossible for Brooklyn to avoid seeing the financial records displayed there, records that detailed transactions totaling more than $50 million through accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Dubai. "You know, Betty," Webb continued, settling into his desk chair and making no move to close the financial documents, "I've been thinking about our custodial staff lately. How long have you been working here?" Brooklyn kept her eyes focused on the trash can she was holding, fighting every instinct that told her to assess Webb's positioning. body language, and potential weapons access. 3 years, Mr. Webb. 3 years next month. 3 years. Webb leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Brooklyn's face. That's a long time to be cleaning the same offices, seeing the same people, hearing the same conversations. I imagine you pick up quite a bit of information working up here in executive country. The question carried implications that made Brooklyn's Navy SEAL training shift into high alert. Webb's tone was casual, almost conversational, but his positioning and the closed door suggested this wasn't a random encounter. Someone had noticed something, and Webb had been designated to probe for information or test her reactions. I don't understand, sir, Brooklyn replied, allowing Betty's accent to become slightly more pronounced as it did when she was nervous. I just clean. I don't listen to conversations. Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course you don't, Betty. You're very professional. Frank Kowalski speaks very highly of your work. Says you're reliable, discreet, never cause any problems. He paused, ostensibly to take a sip from the glass of whiskey he kept in his desk drawer. But Brooklyn recognized the technique as a standard interrogation method designed to create psychological pressure through uncomfortable silence. She responded by continuing to clean, moving to dust the bookshelf behind his desk while maintaining Betty's characteristic focus on her work. The thing is, Betty, Webb continued after letting the silence stretch for nearly a minute, we've been having some security concerns lately. Nothing major, you understand, but some of our competitors seem to have information about our projects that they shouldn't have. Information that could only come from inside our organization. Brooklyn felt her heart rate increase, but kept her breathing steady and her movements consistent with Betty's normal cleaning routine. That sounds very serious. Mr. Webb, I hope you find out who is responsible. I'm sure we will. Webb's tone became more conversational, but Brooklyn could sense the threat underlying his casual words. The FBI has some very sophisticated techniques for identifying security breaches these days. Computer forensics, surveillance analysis, that sort of thing. They can track when someone accesses information they shouldn't have access to, when they photograph documents, even when they send communications to people outside the company. The mention of FBI involvement wasn't necessarily accurate, but it was designed to provoke a reaction from anyone who might be engaging in the activities Webb was describing. Brooklyn recognized the technique and responded by focusing more intently on her dusting, allowing Betty's natural nervousness to show without overacting. I would never do anything like that. Mr. Webb, she said quietly. I need this job. My children depend on me. Of course they do, Betty. And I'm sure you understand how important it is to protect the company that provides your livelihood. Meridian Industries takes care of its employees, but we expect loyalty in return. Webb stood up from his desk and moved closer to Brooklyn, ostensibly to retrieve a book from the shelf she was dusting, but actually positioning himself to observe her reactions more closely. His proximity was another interrogation technique, designed to create discomfort and potentially provoke nervous responses that might reveal deception. You know, Betty, there are rewards for employees who help protect company security. Bonuses, better shifts, opportunities for advancement. But there are also consequences for employees who betray the trust we place in them. The threat was becoming more explicit, and Brooklyn realized that her cover might be compromised or at least under active investigation. Someone had noticed something, a pattern in her movements, inconsistencies in her background, or possibly evidence of her intelligence-gathering activities. The question was whether they suspected Betty Martinez specifically, or were conducting a broader investigation of all employees with access to sensitive areas. I understand, Mr. Webb, Brooklyn replied, completing her dusting and moving toward the door. I should finish my other offices now. Thank you for letting me work while you were here. Of course, Betty. And Betty? Webb's voice stopped her as she reached for the door handle. If you ever notice anything unusual, other employees acting suspiciously, people asking questions they shouldn't ask, Anyone showing interest in things that aren't their concern, I hope you'll let me know. My door is always open for loyal employees. Brooklyn nodded and left Webb's office, her mind already analyzing the conversation and its implications for her mission. The encounter had been carefully orchestrated to test her reactions and gauge her knowledge of Meridian Industries' sensitive activities. Webb's questions had been designed to identify whether she was aware of information beyond what a custodial worker should reasonably know. More concerning was Webb's mention of FBI involvement and computer forensics, which suggested that Meridian Industries might be conducting internal counterintelligence operations to identify potential security breaches. If they had detected her surveillance activities or communications with her handlers, her cover could be blown within days or hours. Brooklyn continued her cleaning routine for the rest of the night, maintaining Betty's normal schedule and behavior patterns while internally assessing her options. She needed to communicate with her handlers about the potential compromise of her mission, but any change in her normal routine could confirm suspicions that were already developing. Situation became more complex when she encountered Margaret Crowley in Richard Hawthorne's outer office around 2 a.m. Margaret was working late as usual, but her demeanor was different, more nervous, less willing to engage in their usual casual conversation. "Oh, Betty," Margaret said when Brooklyn entered to empty the trash cans. "I didn't expect to see you tonight." The comment was odd, since Brooklyn cleaned Hawthorne's offices every Tuesday night according to a schedule that hadn't changed in 3 years. Margaret's nervousness and the unusual comment suggested that she had been briefed about potential security concerns and instructed to pay closer attention to custodial staff activities. "Just following my regular schedule, Miss Crowley," Brooklyn replied, maintaining Betty's professional courtesy despite the changed atmosphere. "Of course." Margaret turned back to her computer, but Brooklyn noticed that she minimized the window. She had been working on behavior that was out of character for someone who had always been open about her work activities during their previous interactions. Brooklyn completed her cleaning quickly and efficiently, but the encounter confirmed her suspicions that Meridian Industries was conducting some form of internal investigation. Margaret's changed behavior, combined with Webb's probing questions, indicated that custodial staff were now considered potential security risks and were being monitored more closely than before. The third incident occurred near the end of her shift, as Brooklyn was returning her cleaning supplies to the storage area on the 35th floor. Frank Kowalski was waiting for her there, which was unusual since their shifts normally overlapped for only about an hour at the beginning of the night. "Betty, can I talk to you for a minute?" Frank's voice carried concern rather than suspicion, but Brooklyn remained alert as she followed him to the small break room that custodial staff used during their shifts. "Is everything okay, Frank?" she asked, settling into one of the plastic chairs while maintaining Betty's slightly defensive posture. "Someone from Human Resources was asking about you today," Frank said, his weathered face creased with worry. "Asking about your work performance, whether you've ever shown interest in company business, whether you've ever been in areas you weren't supposed to be in." Brooklyn felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. If Human Resources was conducting background investigations of custodial staff, her carefully constructed cover identity was about to face scrutiny that it might not survive. "What did you tell them, Frank?" "I told them the truth, that you're one of the best workers I've supervised in 15 years, that you mind your own business, and that you've never caused any problems." Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But Betty, they seem to know things about you that they shouldn't know. Things about your personal life, your children, your work history before you came here." Brooklyn's training told her to remain calm, but Betty Martinez would be frightened by news that her employer was investigating her background. She allowed some of that fear to show in her expression and body language. "What kind of things, Frank?" "They asked about your children's school records in Phoenix, about your ex-husband's employment history, about why you moved to New York, Questions that seemed like they already knew the answers and were testing whether I knew the same information. The revelation that Meridian Industries was conducting detailed background investigations of their custodial staff suggested that Brooklyn's mission was approaching a crisis point. If they were examining Betty Martinez's cover identity closely enough to investigate her fictional family members, they would eventually discover the inconsistencies that had been carefully crafted to withstand casual scrutiny, but not intensive investigation. "Frank, should I be worried about my job?" Brooklyn asked, injecting genuine concern into Betty's voice. "I don't know, Betty, but I think you should be careful for a while. Don't do anything that might draw attention to yourself. Stay focused on your work. Don't go into any areas unless they're specifically on your cleaning list. And maybe don't work any extra hours for a while." Frank's advice was sound from a security standpoint, but it would also limit Brooklyn's ability to gather the intelligence she needed to complete her mission. If she modified her behavior patterns now, it might confirm suspicions that were already developing. But if she continued operating normally, she risked exposing herself to investigation that could destroy 3 years of careful work. Brooklyn thanked Frank for his concern and finished her shift according to her normal routine. But her mind was already working through contingency plans and extraction scenarios. The conversation with Webb, the changed behavior from Margaret Crowley, and Frank's report of human resources investigations all indicated that her cover was under increasing scrutiny. Intelligence she had gathered about Project Nightfall and Dr. Vasquez's research was too valuable to abandon. But continuing her mission might require her to take risks that could expose not only herself, but also the broader intelligence operation that had been built around her infiltration. As Brooklyn left Meridian Industries at the end of her shift, she faced a decision that would determine whether her 3 years of undercover work would result in the successful prosecution of an international conspiracy or the compromise of one of the most successful intelligence operations in recent military history. The mission was entering its most dangerous phase, and Brooklyn Pierce would need to decide whether the intelligence she could still gather was worth the risk of losing everything she had worked to achieve. Brooklyn had been trained to recognize surveillance, but identifying hostile observation while maintaining an undercover identity presented unique challenges that her Navy SEAL instructors had never fully addressed. As she walked from the subway station to her Queens apartment, following her shift at Meridian Industries, every instinct told her she was being watched, but Betty Martinez wouldn't notice professional surveillance unless it was deliberately obvious. The feeling had started during her conversation with Marcus Webb and intensified throughout the week following Frank Kowalski's warning about human resources investigations. Someone was paying attention to Betty Martinez in ways that went beyond the casual oversight of custodial staff, and Brooklyn needed to identify the source and extent of that attention without revealing her awareness of it. Professional surveillance in an urban environment typically involved multiple operators working in rotation to avoid detection, but the team following Betty Martinez was either less skilled than Brooklyn expected or deliberately allowing her to notice their presence. She had identified at least 3 individuals over the past 4 days. A woman in her 30s who appeared at the subway station, coffee shop, and grocery store with suspicious regularity. A middle-aged man who seemed to be walking his dog at precisely the times Betty left for work or returned home. And a younger man who drove different vehicles but parked in locations that provided clear observation of Betty's apartment building. The surveillance pattern suggested that Meridian Industries had contracted with a private security firm rather than involving federal law enforcement, which was both encouraging and concerning. Private investigators would be less likely to uncover the sophisticated intelligence operation behind Betty Martinez's cover identity, but they would also be less constrained by legal procedures and constitutional protections. Brooklyn needed to communicate with her handlers about the developing situation, But her normal dead drop locations and communication schedules were now potentially compromised. If Meridian Industries investigators had identified patterns in Betty's movements, any deviation from her established routine could confirm their suspicions while simultaneously exposing the intelligence network she had been using to transmit information. The solution came from an unexpected source: her relationship with the bodega owner's nephew Carlos, whose romantic interest in Betty had been consistently rebuffed but never completely discouraged. Carlos worked as a delivery driver for various businesses in Queens, which gave him legitimate reasons to be in different locations throughout the city and access to vehicles that wouldn't be associated with Betty's normal routine. Brooklyn had been carefully cultivating Carlos's interest for more than a year, not for romantic reasons but because he represented a potential communication channel that would be impossible for investigators to predict or monitor. His deliveries created opportunities for brief, apparently accidental encounters that could be used to pass information without creating suspicious patterns. Technique required Brooklyn to balance Betty's continued rejection of Carlos's romantic advances with enough encouragement to maintain his interest and willingness to help. It was a delicate psychological manipulation that felt uncomfortable but was necessary for the success of her mission and potentially her survival. "Carlos," Brooklyn said as she encountered him outside the laundromat on Thursday evening, "I need to ask you a favor, but I don't want you to get the wrong idea about why I'm asking." Carlos's face lit up with hope and concern in equal measure. "Of course, Betty, what's wrong? You look worried." "I think my ex-husband might be having me followed. I've been seeing the same people around my apartment, at the subway station, places where I shop. I'm probably being paranoid, but it's making me nervous." The lie came easily because it incorporated elements of truth that would make Betty's behavior appear reasonable to anyone who might be monitoring their conversation. A woman concerned about surveillance by an abusive ex-husband would naturally seek help from someone who cared about her welfare. "That bastard," Carlos said, his protective instincts immediately engaged. "What do you need me to do? Could you maybe drive me to work tonight? And pick me up in the morning? Just for a few days until I figure out what's going on. I'll pay you for the gas." Carlos rejected the offer of payment and immediately agreed to provide transportation, which gave Brooklyn the cover she needed to alter her routine without appearing to be evading surveillance. More importantly, it created opportunities for communication with her handlers that couldn't be predicted by anyone. Monitoring Betty Martinez's established patterns, the first test of this new arrangement came that evening as Carlos drove Betty to Meridian Industries. Brooklyn used the 20-minute drive to assess whether the surveillance team would follow them or position themselves at the building to observe her arrival. She identified at least one vehicle that appeared to be following Carlos's delivery truck, confirming that the surveillance was active and professional. But the real value of the arrangement became apparent when Carlos suggested stopping at a 24-hour restaurant for coffee after picking Betty up from work the following morning. The restaurant was in a different neighborhood from Betty's usual activities, creating an opportunity for Brooklyn to make contact with her handlers without establishing a pattern that could be monitored. Brooklyn's primary handler, a woman known to her only as Maria, was a veteran intelligence officer who had been managing deep cover operations for more than 15 years. Their communication protocol involved seemingly casual encounters in public places where Maria would appear to be an ordinary citizen going about her daily routine. The contact at the restaurant was arranged through coded messages left in a bathroom stall at the subway station, a location that Betty visited daily and where a brief delay wouldn't appear suspicious to anyone monitoring her activities. Maria appeared as a middle-aged woman having breakfast alone, reading a newspaper while waiting for her food. Brooklyn's conversation with Carlos provided cover for the intelligence exchange with Maria. While Carlos used the restroom, Brooklyn moved to the table next to Maria's and engaged in what appeared to be casual conversation about the restaurant's menu. In less than 2 minutes, she was able to report the surveillance activities, Webb's probing questions, and the human resources investigation while receiving updated instructions for managing the developing crisis. Maria's response was both reassuring and alarming. Naval intelligence was aware of the increased security measures at Meridian Industries and had been monitoring communications. That suggested a broader investigation into potential intelligence operations. Brooklyn's mission was considered too valuable to abandon, but contingency plans were being activated in case rapid extraction became necessary. More concerning was Maria's report that other intelligence operations targeting defense contractors had been compromised in recent weeks, suggesting that Meridian Industries' security concerns might be part of a coordinated counterintelligence effort by the defense contracting industry or foreign intelligence services working to protect their sources within American companies. The information you've gathered is critical, Maria said quietly, ostensibly commenting on the restaurant's pancakes while actually providing mission updates. But we may need to move to the extraction phase sooner than planned. How much access do you still have to the high-priority targets? Brooklyn's response had to be carefully worded to avoid attracting attention from other diners or potential surveillance. The usual routines are still in place, but some of the regular customers seem more reserved lately. I think they're being more careful about their conversations. The coded language conveyed that her access to executive offices and sensitive meetings was still intact, but that Meridian Industries officials were implementing operational security measures that would make intelligence gathering more difficult. The window of opportunity for gathering additional evidence about Project Nightfall and related activities was closing rapidly. Maria provided updated communication protocols for emergency situations and confirmed that extraction resources were being positioned in case Brooklyn's cover was definitively compromised. But she also emphasized that the intelligence Brooklyn had already gathered was sufficient to trigger prosecutions and congressional investigations that could dismantle the entire network of corrupt defense contractors and foreign agents. The decision about whether to continue the mission or initiate extraction would depend on Brooklyn's assessment of the immediate threats to her cover and her ability to gather additional high-priority intelligence without exposing herself to capture or assassination. The return trip to Brooklyn's apartment with Carlos provided another opportunity to assess surveillance activities and plan her actions for the following day. The team following them had expanded to include at least 4 vehicles, suggesting that Meridian Industries was taking the potential security breach seriously enough to invest significant resources in identifying the source. But the increased surveillance also created opportunities for Brooklyn to mislead her watchers and potentially identify the full extent of their investigation. If she could determine how much they knew about Betty Martinez's true identity and activities, she could make more informed decisions about the risks and benefits of continuing her mission. The key would be using her Navy SEAL training to turn the surveillance operation against itself, gathering intelligence about her investigators while they attempted to gather intelligence about her. It would require her to operate at the highest levels of her professional skills while maintaining an undercover identity that had become as natural as breathing. Brooklyn Pierce was about to discover whether 3 years of living as Betty Martinez had compromised her edge as an elite military operative or enhanced her ability to function in the most dangerous phase of her intelligence career. The hunter was becoming the hunted, but Brooklyn intended to ensure that she remained the more dangerous predator in this deadly game of deception and survival. The Meridian Industries executive conference room on Friday morning buzzed with tension that Brooklyn could sense even through the frosted glass walls as she pushed her cleaning cart down the 42nd floor hallway. An emergency meeting had been called for 7 a.m., 2 hours before normal business hours, and the participants included not only Meridian's senior leadership, but also individuals Brooklyn didn't recognize from her 3 years of surveillance. Through the partially open doorway, she could see Richard Hawthorne at the head of the table, his normally composed demeanor showing signs of stress that Brooklyn had never observed before. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat to his right, her laptop open and displaying what appeared to be security footage from various locations throughout the building. Marcus Webb occupied his usual position across from Vasquez, but his typical alcohol-induced confidence had been replaced by obvious anxiety. The strangers in the room were immediately recognizable to Brooklyn as federal law enforcement or intelligence officials. Their clothing, posture, and positioning around the conference table marked them as professionals accustomed to conducting investigations rather than being investigated. The presence of federal agents at an emergency Meridian Industries meeting suggested that the situation had escalated beyond internal security concerns to potential criminal prosecution. Brooklyn needed to hear this conversation, but positioning herself to gather intelligence without appearing suspicious would require careful planning. The emergency meeting had disrupted normal building routines, creating opportunities for observation that didn't exist during regular business hours, but also increasing the risk of detection by heightened security awareness. The solution came from an unexpected source, a legitimate maintenance issue. The conference room's coffee service had malfunctioned overnight, creating both a mess that required custodial attention and a reasonable justification for Brooklyn's presence during the meeting. She had discovered the malfunction during her normal overnight cleaning and had followed proper procedures to report it, creating documentation that would support her story if questioned. Betty Martinez would be expected to address the maintenance issue promptly and professionally, which meant entering the conference room to clean the spilled coffee and assess any damage to furniture or equipment. The urgency of the emergency meeting meant that the executives would be unlikely to postpone their discussion for custodial activities, especially since Betty Martinez was considered too insignificant to pose any security risk. Brooklyn knocked gently on the conference room door and waited for acknowledgement before entering. Hawthorne looked annoyed at the interruption, but waved her in with the casual dismissiveness she had observed hundreds of times before. Coffee machine broke. Spilled everywhere, Brooklyn said in Betty's accented English, gesturing toward the service area where brown liquid had pooled on the expensive hardwood table and dripped onto the oriental carpet below. Just clean it up quickly, Hawthorne replied, already turning his attention back to the federal agents. We're in the middle of something important here. Brooklyn began cleaning the spilled coffee while the meeting continued around her, her presence so routine and unremarkable that the participants resumed their discussion almost immediately. But what she heard during the next 20 minutes would fundamentally change her understanding of the situation and the risks she was facing. The security breach is more extensive than we initially believed, one of the federal agents was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to delivering bad news to powerful people. Our cyber forensics team has identified unauthorized access to classified materials, dating back more than 2 years. Dr. Vasquez pulled up a series of computer screens that showed security logs, access records, and what appeared to be network activity analysis. The intrusions have been sophisticated and systematic, she reported. Someone has been gathering information about our most sensitive projects, including material that should have been impossible to access without the highest level security clearances. Brooklyn continued cleaning while mentally cataloging every detail of the discussion. The federal agent's presence meant that her intelligence activities had been detected at the technical level, but their focus on cybersecurity suggested that they hadn't yet identified the human intelligence operation that had been the primary source of the leaked information. Do we have any suspects? Webb asked, his nervousness making his voice slightly higher than normal. We're conducting comprehensive background investigations of all personnel with access to the compromised systems, the second federal agent replied. But the sophistication of the intrusion suggests that we're dealing with professional intelligence operatives rather than opportunistic employees. Hawthorne leaned back in his chair, his expression darkening. "You're telling me that someone has been running a spy operation inside my company for 2 years, and you're just discovering it now?" The techniques used to gather and transmit the intelligence were highly advanced, the first agent said defensively. Multiple communication channels, rotating encryption protocols, and operational security measures that indicate military or intelligence training. Brooklyn felt her heart rate increase, but maintained Betty's steady cleaning routine while processing the implications of what she was hearing. The federal investigation had identified the technical aspects of her intelligence operation, but hadn't yet connected those activities to specific individuals or identified her communication network with naval intelligence. What kind of information was compromised? Dr. Vasquez asked. The federal agents exchanged glances before the senior officer responded. Classified weapons systems data, financial records related to overseas contracts, correspondence with foreign entities, and detailed information about projects that are supposed to be known only to a small number of cleared personnel. Brooklyn recognized her own intelligence gathering in that description, but the agents' focus on cybersecurity meant they were looking for computer intrusions rather than human intelligence operations. Her careful photography of documents, observation of meetings, and infiltration of secure areas had left minimal electronic fingerprints that would be difficult to trace to specific individuals. "We need to know who has been inside our systems," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying implications that made Brooklyn's Navy SEAL training shift into high alert. "And when we find them, we need to send a message that will discourage anyone else who might be thinking about betraying this company." Threat was clear and immediate. If Meridian Industries identified Brooklyn as the source of the intelligence leak, they wouldn't simply fire Betty Martinez or report her activities to law enforcement. Given their involvement in illegal arms trafficking and their willingness to compromise American military operations, they would likely view her exposure as an existential threat that required permanent elimination. "Sir," Dr. Vasquez said, pulling up another screen that showed personnel records, "we've identified several individuals whose access, patterns, and work schedules would have provided opportunities for the intelligence gathering activities described in the investigation report." Brooklyn's pulse increased as she recognized that her 3 years of careful operational security might not have been as invisible as she had believed. The systematic approach suggested by Dr. Vasquez's analysis could potentially identify patterns that would connect Betty Martinez to the intelligence operation, especially if they correlated her work schedules with the timing of security breaches. "How many suspects are we talking about?" Webb asked. 47 employees have had access to all of the compromised areas during the relevant time periods, Dr. Vasquez replied. "But when we narrow the analysis to individuals whose access patterns correlate with known intelligence gathering activities, we're looking at fewer than a dozen potential sources." Brooklyn completed cleaning the spilled coffee and began packing her supplies while listening for any indication that her name or Betty Martinez's identity had been specifically identified. The investigation was closing in on her, but the focus on cybersecurity and access patterns might provide enough misdirection to allow her to complete her mission or extract safely. "I want intensive background checks on all 12 suspects," Hawthorne ordered. "Financial records, family members, communications, travel patterns, everything. And I want surveillance teams assigned to monitor their activities outside of work hours." Instruction confirmed Brooklyn's suspicions about the surveillance she had been detecting. Meridian Industries was conducting comprehensive investigations of potential security threats, which meant that Betty Martinez was already under active observation by professional investigators who would be looking for exactly the kinds of inconsistencies that might expose her true identity. "There's another concern," the senior federal agent said, his tone suggesting that the worst news was yet to come. "Our analysis indicates that the intelligence gathered from Meridian Industries has been transmitted to multiple recipients, including what appears to be military intelligence agencies. This isn't industrial espionage or competitor intelligence gathering. This is a coordinated government operation targeting defense contractors. Brooklyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. The federal agents had identified her operation as a military intelligence mission, which meant that the full resources of the federal government would be brought to bear on identifying and prosecuting everyone involved. Her handlers at Naval Intelligence would be taking defensive measures, but Brooklyn's position as the primary asset inside Meridian Industries made her the most vulnerable target in the entire operation. "Gentlemen," Hawthorne said, his voice carrying deadly calm, "I want to be very clear about something. This company has contracts worth billions of dollars and relationships that are critical to American national security. If someone is trying to destroy what we've built, they won't succeed. Whatever resources are necessary, whatever measures are required, we will identify and eliminate this threat." Brooklyn finished packing her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave the conference room. But Hawthorne's final words stopped her at the door. "And I want daily reports on the surveillance of our suspects. If any of them shows signs of unusual behavior, contacts with unknown individuals, or attempts to access areas outside their normal work assignments, I want to know immediately." As Brooklyn left the conference room and returned to her custodial duties, she realized that her mission had entered its most dangerous phase. The federal investigation had identified the scope and sophistication of her intelligence operation. Meridian Industries was conducting intensive surveillance of potential suspects, and the timeline for completing her mission or extracting safely was collapsing. Rapidly, she had gathered enough evidence to destroy Meridian Industries and expose an international conspiracy that was directly responsible for American military casualties. But extracting that evidence and herself from her current situation would require her to outmaneuver federal agents, corporate security teams, and potentially foreign intelligence operatives who were all working to identify and eliminate the source of the security breach. Brooklyn Pierce had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible. Now she would need to discover whether those skills were sufficient to keep her alive long enough to complete the most important mission of her military career. Brooklyn's weekend routine as Betty Martinez had been carefully crafted over 3 years to provide both operational security and personal recuperation from the psychological demands of deep cover work. Saturdays were reserved for grocery shopping, laundry, and maintaining Betty's apartment in a way that would satisfy casual surveillance. Sundays meant attendance at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where Betty's participation in the Spanish language services had created relationships that reinforced her cover identity while providing emotional support during the isolation of undercover work. But this weekend, Brooklyn's routine would serve a different purpose, identifying the full extent of the surveillance operation that Meridian Industries had mounted against her and determining whether her cover identity could survive the intensive investigation that was now underway. The surveillance team's presence was immediately apparent as Brooklyn left her apartment Saturday morning. The same woman she had identified earlier in the week was positioned at the bus stop across the street, ostensibly waiting for public transportation, but actually monitoring Betty's activities. A van with tinted windows sat parked 2 blocks away, positioned to observe anyone approaching or leaving Brooklyn's building. The middle-aged man with the dog was following his usual walking route, but his timing suggested coordination with the other surveillance elements. Brooklyn needed to test the surveillance team's capabilities and protocols without revealing her awareness of their presence. Betty Martinez would follow her normal weekend routine, but Brooklyn would use that routine to gather intelligence about her investigators while they attempted to gather intelligence about her. The first test came at the grocery store, where Brooklyn deliberately created an opportunity to observe the surveillance team's coordination and communication methods. She entered through the main door, but immediately turned toward the pharmacy section, a deviation from Betty's normal shopping pattern that would force the surveillance team to adjust their positioning. The woman from the bus stop followed her into the store, but had to improvise when Brooklyn's route didn't match the pattern they had apparently studied from previous observations. The woman's momentary confusion and her subtle use of a cell phone to communicate with other team members confirmed that the surveillance operation was professional but not military or federal law enforcement quality. Private security contractors, Brooklyn concluded, probably hired by Meridian Industries to monitor potential suspects without involving federal agencies that might have jurisdictional complications or reporting requirements that could compromise the company's illegal activities. Brooklyn continued her shopping while observing the surveillance team's methods and limitations. They were competent enough to maintain visual contact without being obvious to most subjects, but their operational security showed gaps that a trained military operative could exploit. They relied too heavily on electronic communications. Their positioning was sometimes predictable, and they hadn't established adequate contingency plans for situations where their subject deviated from established patterns. More importantly, their focus appeared to be on Betty Martinez's activities and contacts rather than any attempt to verify the details of her background story. They were conducting surveillance rather than investigation, which suggested that Meridian Industries hadn't yet identified her as a specific suspect in the intelligence leak. The second test came during Brooklyn's lunch at a small restaurant in her neighborhood, where she had established a relationship with the owner's family that dated back to her first weeks as Betty Martinez. The restaurant provided an opportunity to observe how the surveillance team would handle a location where Betty had extensive social connections, and where unusual questions or presence would be immediately noticed. Carlos appeared at the restaurant shortly after Brooklyn arrived, ostensibly delivering supplies, but actually providing another opportunity to assess the surveillance team's response to unexpected contacts. His presence forced the surveillance team to position themselves where they could observe both Brooklyn and Carlos, while remaining invisible to the restaurant's staff and other customers. The surveillance team's handling of the situation revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their operational approach. They successfully maintained observation without being detected by the restaurant staff, but their positioning limited their ability to monitor conversations or identify potential intelligence exchanges between Brooklyn and Carlos. Brooklyn used the opportunity to pass a coded message to Carlos that would eventually reach her handlers, informing them of the surveillance operation and requesting updated instructions for managing the developing crisis. The message was disguised as Betty's continued concerns about her ex-husband's alleged surveillance, maintaining the cover story while communicating essential intelligence about her operational environment. The most challenging test came Sunday morning at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, where Betty's participation in religious services had created genuine relationships with members of the congregation who knew her personal story and would be protective of her privacy. The surveillance team would need to monitor her activities without drawing attention from church members who would be immediately suspicious of strangers showing unusual interest in one of their own. Brooklyn's 3 years of consistent attendance at St. Catherine's had created exactly the kind of community relationships that made surveillance operations difficult and potentially compromising. Father Miguel, the elderly priest who conducted the Spanish-language services, had taken a protective interest in Betty's welfare. Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow in her 70s, had appointed herself as Betty's unofficial neighborhood grandmother. The Morales family had invited Betty to numerous celebrations and had offered assistance with everything from car repairs to childcare for her fictional children. These relationships represented both protection and vulnerability for Brooklyn's cover identity. They provided witnesses who could attest to Betty Martinez's character and consistency, but they also created emotional complications that could affect her operational effectiveness and decision-making. The surveillance team's approach to monitoring Brooklyn's church attendance revealed the limitations of their assignment and training. They positioned themselves outside the church, but didn't attempt to enter the building or monitor her interactions with other congregants, suggesting that their instructions focused on identifying contacts and activities rather than gathering detailed intelligence about her personal relationships. After the service, Brooklyn used her conversations with congregation members to test whether anyone had noticed unusual interest in Betty Martinez from strangers or investigators. The inquiries were disguised as Betty's continued concerns about her ex-husband, but they were actually designed to determine whether Meridian Industries' investigation had extended to her personal life outside of work. The responses were reassuring. None of the congregation members had noticed unusual surveillance or had been approached by investigators asking questions about Betty Martinez. The investigation appeared to be focused on her work activities rather than her broader cover identity, which suggested that her background story was still intact and that she retained operational flexibility. But the most revealing intelligence came from Mrs. Rodriguez, who mentioned that she had received a call from someone claiming to be conducting a survey about neighborhood safety. The caller had asked questions about recent crime, strangers in the neighborhood, and whether residents had noticed anyone new or unusual in recent months. Brooklyn recognized the technique as a standard investigative method for gathering information about potential suspects without revealing the purpose of the investigation. The fact that Meridian Industries was extending their investigation into Betty Martinez's personal life meant that her cover was under more intensive scrutiny than she had initially realized. The information from Mrs. Rodriguez also revealed that the investigation was being conducted with sophistication that suggested professional security contractors rather than internal corporate security. The use of pretextual interviews disguised as neighborhood surveys indicated operational methods typically employed by former law enforcement or intelligence personnel. Brooklyn returned to her apartment Sunday evening with a clearer understanding of the threats she was facing and the operational environment she would need to navigate in the coming days. The surveillance was comprehensive but not overwhelming. The investigation was intensive but hadn't yet identified her as a specific suspect, and her cover identity remained intact despite increased scrutiny. But the federal agents' presence at Friday morning's emergency meeting meant that the timeline for completing her mission was compressed to days rather than weeks. She needed to gather the final pieces of evidence about Project Nightfall and Dr. Vasquez's selective failure systems before her cover was compromised or before Meridian Industries implemented security measures that would prevent her from accessing critical intelligence. The decision about whether to continue the mission or initiate extraction would depend on her assessment of the surveillance team's capabilities and the likelihood that she could complete her intelligence gathering without exposing herself to capture or assassination. Brooklyn Pierce had spent 3 years becoming Betty Martinez, but the next few days would determine whether she could successfully transition back to her true identity or whether both identities would be lost forever. Monday night's shift at Meridian Industries would be Brooklyn's most dangerous yet. The weekend surveillance had confirmed that her activities were being monitored closely enough to detect any significant deviation from established patterns, but not closely enough to prevent her from making the final intelligence gathering push that would complete her mission. The Project Nightfall documents she had discovered in Hawthorne's dropped folder were sufficient to trigger investigations and prosecutions, but Brooklyn's handlers had made it clear that Dr. Vasquez's research into selective failure systems represented the highest priority intelligence target. The systematic murder of American service members through deliberately sabotaged equipment was both the most heinous crime and the most legally actionable evidence she could gather. Brooklyn's plan required her to access Dr. Vasquez's private laboratory during the weekly maintenance window that temporarily disabled motion sensors, photograph the complete research files, and plant additional surveillance devices that would provide ongoing intelligence even after her extraction. The operation would push her custodial access to its absolute limits and would require her to take risks that could definitively compromise her cover. As Betty Martinez clocked in for her shift, Brooklyn noticed immediately that the building's security posture had been elevated. Additional guards were posted at elevator banks, badge access logs were being audited in real time, and surveillance cameras had been repositioned to eliminate blind spots that had previously provided operational flexibility. Frank Kowalski was waiting for her at the custodial supply room with news that confirmed her suspicions about the increased security measures. "Betty, they're doing random inspections of cleaning supplies tonight," Frank said, his weathered face creased with concern. "Some kind of security sweep. They're checking every cart, every supply closet, looking for anything that doesn't belong." The information meant that Brooklyn's surveillance equipment hidden in cleaning supplies was at immediate risk of discovery, which would definitively expose her intelligence operation and trigger immediate arrest or worse. She needed to extract the devices before the inspection reached her assigned floors, but removing them would eliminate her ability to gather the final intelligence about Dr. Vasquez's research. "Frank, what floors are they inspecting tonight?" "Started on the ground floor, working their way up. They're being thorough, taking their time. Probably won't reach the executive floors until after midnight," Brooklyn calculated quickly. The maintenance window for Dr. Vasquez's laboratory was between 1 o'clock and 1:30 a.m., which would coincide with the security inspection of the 38th floor. She would need to access the laboratory, gather the intelligence, and extract her surveillance equipment before the inspection team discovered evidence of her intelligence operation. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, but it represented her last opportunity to gather the evidence that could save American lives and bring down an international conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and defense. Contracting. Brooklyn began her shift according to normal routine, but she used her cleaning activities to position the surveillance equipment for easy extraction and to identify the security inspection team's methods and timing. The inspectors were thorough but predictable, following systematic procedures that created opportunities for someone who understood their patterns. At 12:45 a.m., Brooklyn positioned herself near the service elevator that provided access to Dr. Vasquez's laboratory. The maintenance crew was completing their work on the air filtration system, and the motion sensors would be disabled for another 15 minutes. The security inspection team was currently on the 36th floor, which gave her a narrow window to complete her operation before they reached the laboratory level. Dr. Vasquez was working late as usual, but her laboratory schedule indicated that she typically took a break around 1 a.m. to review communications from her contacts overseas. The break would provide Brooklyn with approximately 10 minutes of access to the research files before Vasquez returned to her work. Brooklyn entered the laboratory complex, using her custodial access, and moved quickly toward Vasquez's private office, where the selective failure systems research was stored. The files were exactly where she expected them to be, in a secure cabinet that was locked but not alarmed, containing research notes, test results, and correspondence that detailed 3 years of systematic sabotage of American military equipment. The photography required precious minutes that Brooklyn couldn't spare, but the intelligence was too important to rush. She documented every page of research notes that detailed the development of remotely triggered failure systems, test results that confirmed the effectiveness of sabotaged equipment, and communications with foreign agents that arranged for the transmission of technical specifications to America's enemies. The most damning evidence was a spreadsheet that correlated equipment failures with American casualties, showing that Dr. Vasquez had been tracking the effectiveness of her sabotage by monitoring death tolls from military operations where compromised equipment had been deployed. Each American service member killed by deliberately sabotaged equipment had been reduced to a data point in Dr. Vasquez's research into optimized casualty ratios. Brooklyn was completing her photography when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the laboratory. Dr. Vasquez was returning from her break early, which meant that Brooklyn was about to be discovered in an area where Betty Martinez had no legitimate reason to be present. The laboratory had multiple exits, but all of them would require Brooklyn to pass through areas where she would be visible to Dr. Vasquez or the security cameras that monitored the research complex. Her only option was to hide in the supply closet adjacent to Vasquez's office and hope that the maintenance activities would provide cover for her eventual extraction. Brooklyn concealed herself among the laboratory supplies just as Dr. Vasquez entered her office. Through the partially open closet door, Brooklyn could observe Vasquez reviewing the research files that had just been photographed, checking to ensure that nothing had been disturbed during her absence. For several minutes, Brooklyn remained motionless while Vasquez worked at her desk less than 10 feet away. The slightest sound or movement would expose her presence and trigger immediate investigation. That would uncover the surveillance equipment, the photographed documents, and Brooklyn's true identity as a Navy SEAL intelligence operative. The situation became more complex when Vasquez received a phone call that appeared to be from one of her foreign contacts. The conversation was conducted in Russian, which Brooklyn understood well enough to recognize that they were discussing accelerated delivery, schedules for compromised equipment, and increased payments for intelligence about American military operations. Brooklyn used her concealed recording equipment to document the conversation while remaining hidden in the supply closet. The intelligence was invaluable direct evidence of Dr. Vasquez coordinating with foreign agents to undermine American military capabilities, but gathering it required her to remain in an increasingly dangerous position as security inspections approached the laboratory level. The phone conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, during which Brooklyn learned that Meridian Industries was preparing to deliver compromised equipment for American operations in Eastern Europe, where tensions with Russian-backed forces were escalating. The equipment failures were timed to coincide with critical missions, ensuring maximum American casualties and minimum operational effectiveness. When Vasquez finally ended the phone call and left her office to return to the main laboratory, Brooklyn faced a critical decision. The security inspection team was now on the 37th floor, which meant she had perhaps 10 minutes to extract herself and her surveillance equipment before the comprehensive search reached the laboratory complex. Brooklyn emerged from the supply closet and moved quickly through the laboratory corridors, retrieving concealed recording devices and cameras from their hiding places in cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. The surveillance gear represented years of intelligence gathering and could potentially implicate her handlers and compromise other ongoing operations if discovered. She was completing the extraction when she encountered Marcus Webb in the corridor outside Dr. Vasquez's laboratory. Webb's presence at 1:30 a.m. in the research complex was unexpected and potentially catastrophic. There was no reasonable explanation for Betty Martinez to be in the same location as the chief financial officer during the middle of the night shift. Betty, Webb said, his voice carrying the suspicious tone she had noticed during their previous encounter. "What are you doing up here? The research labs aren't on your cleaning schedule." Brooklyn felt her pulse increase, but maintained Betty's characteristic nervous deference. Dr. Vasquez called down to custodial, said there was a spill in her office that needed immediate attention. "I was just finishing up." Webb's expression indicated that he wasn't convinced by the explanation. "I'll need to verify that with Dr. Vasquez. Wait here while I check with her." The instruction was clearly intended to prevent Brooklyn from leaving while Webb confirmed her story, which would immediately expose her lie and trigger the investigation that would uncover her true identity. Brooklyn had perhaps 30 seconds to decide whether to maintain her cover and risk exposure, or abandon Betty Martinez's identity and attempt to escape from Meridian Industries. "Of course, Mr. Webb," Brooklyn replied, but as Webb turned toward Dr. Vasquez's office, she made her decision. Brooklyn Pierce's Navy SEAL. Training took over as she abandoned 3 years of careful character development in a single moment. Her posture straightened, her movements became fluid and precise, and the calluses on her palms found familiar positions as she prepared for direct action. Webb sensed the change and began to turn back toward her, but Brooklyn was already moving. Her hand found the pressure point on his neck with surgical precision, applying exactly enough force to render him unconscious without causing permanent injury. Webb collapsed silently to the laboratory floor, his body positioned to appear as though he had simply fainted from stress or alcohol. Brooklyn had perhaps 5 minutes before Webb regained consciousness and triggered every alarm in the building. She used that time to complete her extraction of surveillance equipment and to reach the service elevator that would carry her to the custodial areas, where she could retrieve her emergency extraction kit. The kit contained everything she needed to transition from Betty Martinez back to Brooklyn Pierce: different clothing, identification documents, communication equipment, and enough cash to reach the extraction point where naval intelligence would be waiting. But using the kit would mean abandoning Frank Kowalski, Margaret Crowley, and the other people who had shown genuine kindness to Betty Martinez over the past 3 years. Brooklyn reached the service elevator as the security inspection team reached the 38th floor. She could hear them discovering Webb's unconscious form and triggering the building's lockdown procedures that would prevent anyone from entering or leaving until the security breach was resolved. Elevator carried her to parking garage level, where her emergency extraction route led through maintenance tunnels to a subway access point 6 blocks away. Brooklyn changed clothes in a utility room, transforming herself from Betty Martinez, the janitor, into a woman who could disappear into New York City's millions of anonymous residents. As she prepared to abandon Meridian Industries forever, Brooklyn transmitted a final encrypted message to her handlers: package delivered. Extraction initiated. Betty Martinez is gone. The intelligence she had gathered, particularly the evidence of Dr. Vasquez's selective failure systems and the recorded conversation about compromised equipment bound for Eastern Europe, would save American lives and expose an international conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. But the personal cost of her successful mission would remain with Brooklyn Pierce for the rest of her military career. Frank Kowalski would never understand why Betty Martinez had simply vanished from his life. Margaret Crowley would wonder what had happened to the quiet janitor who had listened to her problems with genuine concern. The congregation at St. Catherine's Catholic Church would worry about Betty Martinez and her fictional children, never knowing that their prayers for her safety had been answered in ways they could never imagine. 6 months after, Brooklyn Pierce walked out of Meridian Industries for the final time. The consequences of her 3-year intelligence operation were reverberating through the highest levels of American government and international law enforcement. The evidence she had gathered triggered congressional hearings, federal prosecutions, and diplomatic crises that would reshape the defense contracting industry permanently. Richard Hawthorne had been arrested at his Connecticut estate on charges of treason, arms trafficking, and conspiracy to murder American service members. The Project Nightfall documents provided prosecutors with detailed evidence of his role in selling classified military technology to foreign powers, while the selective failure systems research proved that he had personally authorized the sabotage of equipment used by American forces. OVERSEA's Dr. Elena Vasquez had been found dead in her laboratory 3 days after Brooklyn's extraction, an apparent suicide by cyanide poisoning that prevented her testimony from exposing the full extent of the international network she had been serving. Intelligence analysts suspected that foreign agents had eliminated Vasquez to prevent her from revealing the identities of other operatives within the American defense establishment, but the investigation into her death remained classified. Marcus Webb had survived his encounter with Brooklyn, but had suffered complete memory loss regarding the events of that night. a condition that neurologists attributed to alcohol-induced blackouts, but that Webb himself suspected was related to the mysterious disappearance of Betty Martinez. His testimony to congressional investigators had been limited and often contradictory, but the financial records Brooklyn had documented provided sufficient evidence to prove his involvement in money laundering and foreign corruption. The human cost of Meridian Industries' activities had been staggering. Congressional investigators had identified more than 200 American military casualties directly attributable to deliberately sabotaged equipment, while the intelligence Brooklyn gathered had prevented the deployment of compromised systems that would have killed hundreds more service members in planned operations. Across Eastern Europe and the Middle East, Brooklyn herself had returned to active duty with Naval Special Warfare Command, but her extended deep cover operation had left psychological scars that required ongoing therapy and careful reintegration into military life. The transition from Betty Martinez back to Brooklyn Pierce had been more difficult than anyone had anticipated, complicated by identity erosion and the emotional attachments she had formed. During her undercover assignment, Commander Sarah Chun had debriefed Brooklyn extensively about her operational experiences, but even Chun's decades of intelligence experience hadn't fully prepared her for the complexity of Brooklyn's psychological state following the mission. The line between Brooklyn Pierce and Betty Martinez had become blurred in ways that required professional intervention. An extended recovery time. You accomplished something that will save American lives for years to come, Chun had told Brooklyn during one of their debriefing sessions. But I also know that the personal cost was higher than anyone expected. When we first designed this operation, Brooklyn had struggled to articulate her feelings about abandoning the relationship she had formed as Betty Martinez. Frank Kowalski's genuine concern for her welfare, Margaret Crowley's trust and friendship, and the congregation at St. Catherine's Catholic Church who had accepted Betty as part of their community, all of these connections had been severed without explanation or closure. They were good people who deserved better than being lied to for 3 years, Brooklyn had said. Frank especially. He tried to protect Betty from things he didn't even understand. He was a father figure to someone who didn't really exist. Chun had nodded with understanding. Deep cover operations always involve deception, but extended assignments create relationships that feel real because they are real, even if they're based on false premises. The kindness those people showed to Betty Martinez was genuine, and your appreciation of that kindness is also genuine. The most difficult aspect of Brooklyn's reintegration had been accepting that Betty Martinez's relationships couldn't be maintained or explained without compromising ongoing intelligence operations and national security interests. Frank Kowalski, Margaret Crowley, and the others would never know that Betty Martinez had been a Navy SEAL working to protect American service members from the very company that employed them. Brooklyn had requested permission to provide anonymous financial assistance to Frank Kowalski, whose custodial salary barely covered his living expenses. But even that gesture had been denied due to operational security concerns. Any contact with people who had known Betty Martinez could potentially expose Brooklyn's true identity and compromise her ability to conduct future intelligence operations. The psychological evaluation that followed Brooklyn's debriefing had diagnosed her with what military psychologists termed identity integration disorder, a condition common among long-term deep cover operatives who had difficulty distinguishing between their true identity and their assumed persona. The treatment required extensive therapy focused on reinforcing Brooklyn's core identity while processing the emotional experiences she had accumulated as Betty Martinez. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Navy psychologist assigned to Brooklyn's case, had explained the condition in terms that helped Brooklyn understand her own internal conflicts. Your brain spent 3 years creating neural pathways and emotional associations connected to Betty Martinez's identity, Dr. Williams had said. Those pathways don't disappear when the mission ends. They become part of who you are. The goal isn't to erase Betty Martinez from your memory, but to integrate those experiences into your identity as Brooklyn Pierce. The therapy had been challenging but ultimately successful. Brooklyn had learned to appreciate the skills and insights she had gained during her time as Betty Martinez while maintaining her core identity as a Navy SEAL and intelligence operative. The experience had made her more empathetic, more aware of social inequalities, and more sensitive to the human costs of the military and intelligence operations she supported. Brooklyn's successful infiltration of Meridian Industries had also earned her recognition within the intelligence community, including promotion to lieutenant commander and assignment to the Navy's most elite special operations units. Her experience with long-term deep cover operations had made her valuable for future missions requiring similar skills, but she had also made it clear that she preferred assignments with more clearly defined timelines and extraction procedures. Congressional hearings triggered by Brooklyn's intelligence had resulted in comprehensive reform of defense contracting procedures, including enhanced background investigations, improved oversight of classified research, and stronger penalties for companies found to be compromising American military operations. The reforms wouldn't prevent all future corruption, but they would make it significantly more difficult for companies like Meridian Industries to operate with impunity. More importantly, the investigation had identified and disrupted an international network of arms dealers, corrupt officials, and foreign intelligence operatives that had been systematically undermining American military capabilities for more than a decade. The prosecutions resulting from Brooklyn's intelligence had sent a clear message that betraying American service members would result in severe consequences for everyone involved. But for Brooklyn herself, the most meaningful outcome of her mission had been the knowledge that her sacrifice of Betty Martinez's relationships had prevented the deaths of American military personnel who would never know that their lives had been saved by a Navy SEAL who had spent 3 years mopping floors and emptying trash cans in a Manhattan office building on quiet evenings when Brooklyn found herself missing the simple routine of Betty Martinez's life. She reminded herself that every relationship she had abandoned, every deception she had maintained, and every moment of psychological stress she had endured had been justified by the lives saved and the justice achieved through her intelligence. Operation. Frank Kowalski would never understand why Betty Martinez had disappeared from his life, but dozens of American service members would return home safely to their families because of the intelligence she had gathered. Margaret Crowley would wonder about her friend who had vanished without explanation, but families across America would avoid the grief of losing loved ones to deliberately sabotaged equipment. The congregation at St. Catherine's Catholic Church would continue to pray for Betty Martinez and her fictional children, never knowing that their prayers for her safety and success had been answered in ways that helped protect the freedom and security they took for granted. 2 years after the conclusion of Operation Nightfall, Lieutenant Commander Brooklyn Pierce stood in the cemetery at Arlington National Cemetery, paying her respects at the grave of Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, her former SEAL team leader, whose death had been one of the first casualties she had connected to Meridian Industries sabotage operations. The headstone bore Morrison's name, rank, and the dates of his service, but it couldn't capture the full story of how his death had been caused by the very people contracted to protect him. Brooklyn's investigation had revealed that Morrison's unit had been equipped with compromised communication systems that had allowed enemy forces to track their movements and set the ambush that claimed his life. Standing in the quiet dignity of Arlington, Brooklyn reflected on the strange journey that had led from Morrison's death to her own transformation from Navy SEAL to custodial worker to intelligence operative. The mission had asked her to become someone else completely, to live a life that wasn't her own, and to form relationships based on deception in service of a truth that could never be fully revealed. The weight of those secrets would remain with Brooklyn for the rest of her life. She would never be able to tell Frank Kowalski that his kindness to Betty Martinez had provided emotional support that enabled a critical intelligence operation. Margaret Crowley would never know that her trust in a humble janitor had helped expose corruption at the highest levels of government. The congregation at St. Catherine's would never understand that their acceptance of Betty Martinez had sustained an undercover operative through the most challenging assignment of her career. But Brooklyn had learned to carry those secrets as part of her service to her country and her commitment to protecting American service members from the betrayals and conspiracies that threatened them. The relationship she had formed as Betty Martinez had been based on deception, but the kindness and concern those relationships had generated were real and had made her a better person and a better officer. As Brooklyn prepared to leave Arlington and return to her duties with Naval Special Warfare Command, she paused at Morrison's grave one final time. The intelligence operation that had begun with his death had saved countless other lives, but Brooklyn knew that the true measure of her success wasn't in the prosecutions achieved or the conspiracies exposed. The real victory was in the American service members who would come home safely to their families because someone had been willing to spend 3 years living as someone else, earning the trust of good people through deception, and carrying the weight of secrets that could never be fully shared. Brooklyn Pierce had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or direct action, but with patience, deception, and the willingness to sacrifice one's own identity in service of others. She had become Betty Martinez so completely that it had nearly cost her own sense of self, but in the end, she had emerged from the experience with a deeper understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the complex moral landscape of intelligence work. The janitor's secret would remain buried with Betty Martinez, but Brooklyn Pierce would carry the lessons learned from that secret for the rest of her life. And somewhere in Queens, Frank Kowalski would continue to wonder about the quiet woman who had worked beside him for 3 years before vanishing, without explanation, never knowing that Betty Martinez's disappearance had marked the end of one of the most successful intelligence operations in American military history. The fluorescent lights in the 42nd floor hallway no longer flickered, and the squeaky wheel on the custodial cart had been replaced. But the secrets that had been gathered in those corridors would continue to protect American lives for years to come. Brooklyn Pierce had stopped being Betty Martinez, but the impact of her transformation would last forever. This story explores themes that are as relevant today as ever: the sacrifices made by those who serve in shadows, the human cost of deception in service of truth, and the moral complexity of protecting freedom through methods that can't always be openly acknowledged. If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply entertained you during these hours we've spent together, I invite you to show your support by subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. Your engagement helps me continue creating these detailed, novel-length stories that dive deep into the human experience of extraordinary circumstances. Share this story with friends who appreciate complex narratives about duty, sacrifice, and the price of protecting others. Leave a comment about what resonated with you most. Was it Brooklyn's struggle with identity, the moral complexity of her deception, or perhaps the relationships that transcended the lies they were built upon? This is the kind of storytelling that takes considerable time and research to craft properly, but it's worth every hour when it reaches people who value depth, authenticity, and the exploration of what it truly means to serve something greater than oneself. Until our next story together, remember that the most important battles are often fought by people whose names will never be known, whose sacrifices will never be fully understood, but whose dedication keeps us safe and free. Subscribe now, and let's continue exploring these remarkable stories of courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable human spirit.